The other one is on that pressure point of what is your goal exactly? Is your goal a certain number of dollars per year? Is your goal for that meeting getting the funding, or is it whatever that funding is going towards? Whatever outcome that funding is going towards that you're excited about. There's all this research in motivation that you've probably seen about, we get motivated by goals that are the ultimate aspiration, but we don't like the means to those ends. Those means goals are really tedious. But in managing a sales force or a fundraising team, it's too easy to set those targets that are actually means, not the end.
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Piyush Tantia and Sarah Welch. Welcome to What the Fundraising.
Thank you, Valerie. Great to be here.
Piyush, do you want to kick us off telling everybody a little bit about you and your work? And then Sarah, I'd love for you to do the same. And then we're just going to sort of dive in and have a really fun conversation.
Sure, I can kick us off. So I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Ideas 42, which is in short, a behavioral science research and design lab. So we go out and work on various issue areas, thinking about how human behavior affects a social problem. So whether that be education or healthcare or charitable giving, and we apply insights from academic research and psychology, behavioral economics, to understanding those problems better and then designing and testing solutions in the field. So over the last, 9 years or so, I've become quite obsessed with charitable giving. I've been doing a bunch of work on that, experiments with giving platforms, lab studies, you name it, talking to lots of people.
I love that. And I love the fact that you use the word obsessed, because that's usually what I talk about in my work. I'm like, I've sort of become obsessed with this problem. Sarah, tell everyone a little bit about you.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Welch. I'm an associate managing director at Ideas 42. And I have had the good fortune to work with Piyush for, I think we're at 11 years now, Piyush, on our giving work and then on different projects beyond that as well. And now I also spend all of my time on our giving projects. And yeah, I am excited to be here today.
Amazing. Well, we can start there. So when I reached out and shared an early copy of my book with you, Piyush, I was talking a little bit about sort of the reorientation of our focus on donor behavior to our focus on fundraiser behavior. And just for a little bit of context, like the way that this sort of happened to me is that, I was a frontline fundraiser who really hated fundraising, and then became executive coach certified, got trained with Dr. BJ Fogg in habit and behavior design, and also spent some time with IDEO and design thinking. And those frameworks really came together and changed the way that I fundraised. But as I started to think more about, Dr. Fogg's work in particular around like the Fogg behavior model and the fact that in order for any action to take place, we need enough motivation to take that action, the ability to take that action, and then be prompted to take that action. There was one day where I was like, wait a second. So if we're thinking about applying this model to donors, the prompt 80% of the time is the fundraiser. And what if the fundraiser isn't getting over the action line? Like, what if they are feeling so much resistance that they aren't being able to take action? And what if we started to think about the donors as the lagging indicator instead of the donors as the leading indicator in sort of fundraising health? And so that is what sent me down my obsession with trying to look at the ways that we typically think about these problems, starting with the moment of the kind of money movement and back it up to the people working to inspire and motivate that movement in the first place. So I'm curious, even just like hearing that or thinking about that in relationship to your work or some of the studies that you all have done, what are some of the first things that like come to mind?
For me, the first thing that comes to mind is that Ideas 42 is a nonprofit, which means Sarah and I are both fundraising to be able to do this work. And, being behavioral science nerds, we've always designed for ourselves as well, whether that's staying on top of our fundraising and business development or whether that's sticking to an exercise routine or diet or whatever. So we do that. I would say we do that with perfect discipline, but we design ways to get ourselves motivated when there's some tedious fundraising task or something we're not looking forward to. Yeah, it's a very important question.
Yeah. And I'll add, I think that, you're right, that aha moment we also had many years ago now, when we first started this work. I think we started with a kind of a common assumption. If you're not familiar with the space, you were like, well, donors probably just like sit down and think, where should I give my money away today? And then they, they pull up their browser or whatever website and start searching. And it very quickly, right, became apparent that isn't what happens. Like you just laid out. It's often a solicitation most of the time. And then so the challenge from the donor angle, if you want to persist in that approach, is how do you get in at that moment? So yeah, I agree. I think focusing on the fundraiser makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so I love that you started to talk about your own experience, like fundraising and sort of that side of it. And so I'm curious, like, as you think about maybe consciously or like unconsciously, you've, designed your behaviors to deal with uncomfortable fundraising moments or those tasks that you really don't want to do. Like, what are some of the ways in which you've used your behavioral science background to optimize your fundraising?
Sarah, since you've been thinking a lot about this recently, why don't you go first?
Yes. Well, I know. Let me give you a few examples. So one, as I'm talking to you, I'm actually looking around my space, and I'm not going to show you because it's a little too embarrassing, but I look like a crazy person a little bit. I have sticky notes like on my walls with common, like answers to common questions that I know I get in calls. So, what is our process? We changed the way we describe our process recently. And so I have the new process. Piyush, I'm embarrassed to share this with you. I have the new process up on my wall so that I say it correctly, right? The other thing I have is our behavioral diagnosis prompts on our wall. So whenever we think about a problem from a behavioral perspective, there's a series of questions that Piyush worked on, I don't know now, 15 years ago. And I've got those up on my wall. And I use those also so that, in the moment, I can focus on building a relationship, and then I can look and kind of pull that information in, knowing that, you get nervous, like you don't have everything top of mind when you need it to be. And so designing for myself, knowing where my weaknesses are, and then trying to fill those gaps in with in my case, physical reminders to make sure I say the right things has been really helpful. So that's one piece. More broadly, I think a critical part for me has been designing a workflow that holds me accountable to the key relationships that I need to be working on, and having some fellow colleagues along to hold me accountable as well, to leverage some social pressure, including Piyush and some other colleagues.
Yeah, and in my case,
Piyush, what do you do?
Those come from, again, scheduling time to do some of the tasks around fundraising that might be very tedious, like organizing my address book, making sure I have the most current information at the right place. Those sorts of things get easily become a mess over time. What I've always reflected on with this work, and I was a partner at a management consulting firm before this, and my job was also, selling work, right? It should be easy, right? It should be easy. These are people I like to talk to. And so I should be motivated to set up meetings with them and go talk to them and have a conversation. And funnily, when I do have those conversations, they are fun. And that is what I try to remind myself, because when I'm setting up the conversations or planning for them, I have this picture in my head that this person really doesn't want to hear from me and I'm bothering them now. And they're going to begrudgingly take that meeting with me. And then I have to remind myself that, actually that's not the case. And when I haven't talked to someone for 2 years and I reach out, they usually say, "Oh, I was wondering what happened to you. I'm glad you reached out."
Okay, so you both said so many things in there that I'm like, struggling to sort of pick my pathway here. But I'm going to start with, like, Sarah, some of the things that you said around your like how you deal with some of maybe your nervousness around different fundraising moments and sort of getting it right in terms of your language. And I love that you shared sort of how you use your environment to, it sounds like, increase your confidence and, help you deal with maybe some of that fear. And I'm curious, like in the book, I talk a lot about nervous system dysregulation. And I talk a lot, we're seeing this pretty like mass epidemic of burnout across the nonprofit sector. I mean, I think the last poll, like official poll, was showing something like 48% of nonprofit professionals in 2021 were saying they were dealing with burnout. I actually think those rates are suspected to be much higher now, up around 65-75%, because it's sort of been like one fundraising challenge after another in terms of coming out of the pandemic and then challenging economic experiences into an election year. Like we're just seeing like a very serious staffing crisis and pretty tremendous turnover. And we talk a lot about this in the sector in terms of overwork, right? That people are working too much and so they're burnt out and they need more sort of boundaries around work-life balance. But one of the things that I found in my coaching was that even when people were not working too much, they were still really burnt out. And so I started to go down sort of my own research pathway around what are other things that lead to burnout and how, that perhaps aren't related to overwork. And so in the book, I talk about 5 of them that really relate to fundraising: pressure, isolation, power dynamics, rejection, uncertainty, and sort of the relationship between those elements and stress, right? And then when that stress cycle doesn't end, like ultimately kind of leading to burnout. And the reason I'm sharing this background in connection to what you said around your nervousness is that because so many fundraisers are in this heightened stress state, whether you consider it burnout yet or not, their sort of threshold around fear feels really like thin, that like a little bit like their fear going into a meeting and having the donor say no or saying the wrong thing in the email, like their stress response is already activated. And that ends up creating all this resistance for them to actually be able to take that action. And so we see this sort of like mass paralysis across the sector. And sometimes we see this oscillating between paralysis and shiny object syndrome, which is probably like a flight response, right? It's like, oh, I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do this, which is like helping them sort of flee some of their anxious feelings, or they're in that more of that paralysis state. And so I'm giving all that contextual background, thinking about sort of actually one of the things you have in your environment around those like behavioral questions, like when you are finding that people can't take an action, what are some of the initial things that you all think about in terms of designing solutions for that? And do you think about it, and how do you think about it differently depending on sort of the stress state of those people?
All right, here. I'll throw some stuff out, Piyush, and you can riff on it. So one thing when we see people, so the way we think about maybe someone not taking action they need to take is we often use the metaphor of the ostrich, right? So like if you're ostriching on something, you're sort of hiding your head on the sand, you're avoiding it. And so we might look at when that's happening, you want to understand why. And so then there are a few patterns that we look for in the environment, right? And so one of them is, and when you're speaking, right, like uncertainty is a big piece of it, right? So if there's a lot of uncertainty as humans, we try to avoid that. And then I think regret is another one. Regret avoidance is another piece that you often see people avoiding. And then those things together, I think one of the critical things about behavioral science is it can sometimes let you understand an observed behavior differently, right? So from afar, you look and you say, oh, this person, they're just not doing what they need to do. Like, what's wrong with them, right? Like, do I need to, are they burnt out? Do I need to pay them more money? I don't know what it is. Are they just bad at their jobs? But then with behavioral science, right, you can dig in and say, well, wait, hold on. This is a scenario where there's a lot on the line. There's a lot of regret, fear. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? And so that can be contributing to what appears to be this like procrastination or paralysis issue. And so then for in terms of designing solutions, right? Then you're starting to look at, well, how do I remove some of that? How do I take away some of that uncertainty and ambiguity and fear?
Yeah, and I'll add to that, when we start broadly answering a question like that, we ask a lot of why questions. So what is going? I think ostriching is a very, very good hypothesis here, but it may turn out that for some people, they're just not thinking of it at all for some action. And if that's the case, then the solution is different from solving ostriching. But if they're thinking about it a lot, and avoiding it because they're anticipating something negative to happen, a rejection, an unpleasant meeting, or whatever, a failure, something, ghosting, which is very common. People just don't get back to you. That's silent rejection. Then they will avoid those actions. Solving ostriching is not easy. Unfortunately, it's not easy. The only idea we have for solving it is reminding people that, hey, the news isn't that bad. There's help. It'll be okay. It'll be fine. And that's kind of why I try to remind myself of the good conversations and the fun conversations that I have in the process of this. For me personally, of those 5 things you listed, rejection is my Achilles heel. After all these years, I figured out how to manage the rest of it, but not the rejection yet.
So what do you do? Let's say you know that about yourself and you just had a meeting with a funder. You really thought it was going to close this big, deal. They said no. You know that about yourself. What do you do after that meeting to take care of yourself or to maybe make sure that you aren't doing something that will get kind of messed up based on kind of the way that you're feeling post that meeting?
For me, it's really important to not be isolated in that moment. So, go talk about that experience with somebody who's in the same boat with me, for someone to just validate, like, hey, it's not you, it's not them, it just wasn't a fit, right? And maybe something else will work, or maybe, there's something else we can partner with that funder on, and it's okay. And then remembering that, if you don't make those attempts, then you're going to get no successes. Right? You have to anticipate that you're getting a certain amount of rejection. It's funny, we do innovation work, right? To always say about innovation work that if you don't have a pretty high failure rate, then you're not innovating. So if somebody asks me, how should you measure innovation? That's we should measure your failure rate. Because if it's 0, you're not doing it. But yet, putting that on fundraising is much harder because that rejection can feel so personal.
Okay, there are a few things in there that are, I think, really good advice, like that sort of expectation setting. I also think because then people, I always joke that, I was sure I was a bad fundraiser for so many years because I was like, there's no way that good fundraisers want to throw up before a donor meeting, right? And so there's a certain amount of everybody has it figured out but me, that then I think probably adds to those feelings of isolation. And so just sort of normalizing expectations and helping people anticipate things that are normal in those moments or in those roles is a really helpful tool. I'm curious. Okay, so something that you said before that's I really like what you said around sort of the difference between what we see and what's actually happening, and the sort of how we need to be careful to not label something as label the visible expression of something as the problem before getting curious about why it's happening and sort of what's behind that, and then solving for that why. Did I hear that right? Am I following that right?
Yeah, I think you're referring to not taking things personally or blaming yourself or blaming that donor, or just seeing the situation for what it is, that it was just a difference in interests. Donor is interested in X, we're pitching Y. Well, okay, those things just don't happen to fit today, or maybe there's an aspect of Y that fits later.
Yes.
Different way.
Yes. So both in terms of our sort of interpretation of behavior that is affecting us, and I heard you say something when you were talking about the fundraiser, like they're bad at their job or something, right? Because they're not taking action. So it sounds like then also applied though to those situations, right? When you see a fundraiser who's struggling or not hitting their mark, or maybe not having as many donor meetings as you expected, that it's not, we can so easily go into those stories like they're lazy, they aren't committed to our mission, they, blank, 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 when really there's a lot of curiosity necessary to figure out what's actually sort of causing the behavior that we're seeing.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Right. And that's a sort of one of the, again, fundamental parts, I think, to behavioral science is recognizing there's the person and then there's the situation. And that we often, if we're not familiar with the space, right, we often assume so much is the person, but actually the other way around, right? The situation plays a critical role.
Okay. So thank you for leading me right where I wanted to go. You would think we had this perfectly scaffolded out, but we did not. But that is exactly what I want to talk about. So environment, situation plays such a huge role in our behavior. And one of the things I mentioned, over email was that the environment of a fundraiser is unbelievably dynamic, particularly for frontline fundraisers. So like Sarah, you talked about sort of the, space around your desk to help you with those meetings. But for a fundraiser who has every meeting in a different coffee shop, or like whose day is always a different, like the workflow, doesn't like when they're like workflow, like how would I have a workflow? I have like 11 back-to-back meetings, or I'm driving a car, and I'm on the phone while I'm driving the car. Like, how do you think about solutions when folks are trying to change their behavior in an ever-changing environment?
I mean, those are what matters here is what variables affect behavior or have impact. And it may be that even though the environment on the surface is dynamic, there's something common, right? And that may vary for different people. I mean, okay, so a different coffee shop each time. Is there something about that? Like maybe, you don't like the uncertainty of if you're going to find a table in a quiet spot or not. And that's common across just any of these meetings because you're always looking for some public place because you don't have an office. You're not going to the donor's office. Like, is there some element that's common that matters in this? If you're going from meeting to meeting, so if that's a common feature of your calendar, we know from a bunch of psychology research that task switching is really costly. So, okay, maybe if I fundraise for a particular organization, I pitch the same program, then there's less task switching going from funder to funder in theory, but in reality, any good fundraiser is customizing very much, probably spending a lot of the meeting talking about that funder's interests, what's happening in their lives, what they want to do, what's going on. So they are task switching. And that's the cost. And if that's the cost, then let's put buffer time between the meetings. If it's the uncertainty of finding a quiet spot, then maybe you scope out the places in each town that you need to visit that are reliable. If that's the thing that bothers you a lot. Or you have a backup plan, like maybe if there's no table in the coffee shop, we're going to take the coffee to go and just have a walk or something. So that's the power, I think, of translating the behavioral science into design, is you go deep into what precisely in the situation is triggering a barrier or is helpful. And can you find those commonalities? And usually there are common threads.
Okay. So there's a few things that you said that I sort of want to like double click on. I mean, I love sort of like how granular you're getting around the resistance in terms of like, is that not finding a table a fear and like adding to this additional fear, and you sort of don't realize the layers of discomfort that you're adopting with each of these meetings, and like how do you chip away at them one by one. And I think about all the like little ways we do this in our lives, right? To either be like easygoing, right? We're like, oh, where do you want to meet? And like, what if instead of that, you were just like, hey, which of these 3 coffee shops would you like to meet at? And like, all 3 of them have enough space, and you're much more likely, and the environment, and that they make your kind of coffee or whatever it is, right? And like, it's a tiny little behavior change that then addresses this like lingering resistance that maybe you weren't even kind of aware of before. Is that what we're talking about here?
Exactly. Yeah, and it may be something totally different. Like for me, when I meet somebody over a meal or coffee or drinks or something like that, the thing I worry about is, oh, I'm going to have to pivot to business at some point in the conversation. And that's hard. And, and it's awkward. And I still don't have a good solution for this. So, so if you do it, Sarah, you do it.
I had a great fundraising coach earlier in my career who said, make the ask over soup. That was like his tagline. He said, make the ask over soup. And what it allowed me to start to do was say, like, we had set up the intention of the meeting a certain way. So there was sort of no surprise. And we'd catch up a little bit at the beginning. And I would say something like, I want to talk more about this. And I want to hear more about, taking your kids off to college and all of those things. I also don't want it to be lingering in the back of either of our minds, the conversation we wanted to have around blank. So are you okay if we just like dive into that for 15, 20 minutes? Let's get that out of the way. And then we can just sort of enjoy more like catch up and like conversation. And what do you think about that?
I love it. Thanks for the free coaching.
The script is so helpful.
Well, okay. So that is what I thought when you said that originally. I was like, okay, so how would I address this behavior resistance in a client, right? I would give them 3 transition lines. Like I would say like, okay, you're struggling to transition. Let's think about 3 lines that feel organic to you that allow you to make that feel authentic. And then, yeah, I think that piece around like waiting till the end is then you spend the whole meeting like looking for the right moment. And then you don't get to be as connected in the conversation as you want to be. And so that's where the like do it early. It's like, then you can sort of let go of that, like looking for the clue to do the right transition, but then having some language, hopefully removes the barrier around it. What are other things like, as we're just sort of like riffing here, that you can think about either in terms of your own fundraising or as you maybe think about, like, I'm sure in terms of the ways in which you've studied kind of donor behavior and fundraising, you can imagine moments where, okay, even if that experience is really optimized to donors, it still requires fundraisers to do these 5 steps ahead of time, whether it's write the email, click send on the email, any of those things. So thinking about the typical behaviors of fundraisers, like where could you imagine other moments of resistance and just sort of like brainstorming out possible strategies?
I mean, there must be some people or a lot of people in any fundraiser's list that they don't look forward to seeing or asking for whatever reason. Maybe they don't feel a rapport, or they don't have common interests, or it's a real struggle because they love talking about sports and you really don't know anything about sport or something like that. And what do you do in that situation? If you don't have a colleague to hand them off to who may match better, the only solution I've come up with for myself is I turn it into a challenge. It's like, there's got to be something, some interest I share in common with this person, or something that I'm curious about, or something I can learn from them or about them. That's interesting. And then I challenge myself to find that.
I remember this is a little bit adjacent, but I remember when I was in grad school, going to a dinner that was ostensibly a networking dinner and feeling really, like so much dread about that. And every dinner I had been to, like I had to have these really smart questions to ask the speaker or something. And I just remember feeling so like they were so pointless. They like never worked, right? And then I went to this one dinner and this woman, Elizabeth, was talking to the speaker and asked him where he was from. And then he mentioned his kids and she asked about his kids. And all of a sudden I had this like aha moment where I realized, oh, this is way better. You don't have to have these like prepared questions about subject matter. Actually, the most important part, right, is starting to get to know someone and building that relationship. And Piyush, like you're saying, like being curious about them is far better than, being this like transactional networker, as it were.
The other one is on that pressure point of what is your goal exactly? Is your goal a certain number of dollars per year? Is your goal for that meeting getting the funding? Or is it whatever that funding is going towards? whatever outcome that funding is going towards that you're excited about. There's all this research in motivation that you've probably seen about, we get motivated by goals that are the ultimate aspiration, but we don't like the means to those ends. Those means goals are really tedious. But in managing a sales force or a fundraising team, it's too easy to set those targets that are actually means, not the end. And I find when I let go of that target, even for a single meeting, and I'm just talking about that thing I'm really excited about, that idea that I want to chase that I'm really excited about, that excitement is completely contagious. And you can see the energy, you can feel the energy in the conversation, you can see the other person getting excited about it and being curious about it. And often those are the conversations that lead to funding. Sometimes years later, sometimes with that person introducing me to someone else who might fund that thing, even if they can't. And in all sorts of funny ways in which, that thing I'm excited about ends up happening.
Piyush, I think building on the excitement piece and thinking about our research, right? One of the things that has emerged is not just us, but storytelling is so important, right? For donors to get excited about project or a giving opportunity in some way. And I think as a fundraiser, it can be really hard to have the patience to tell that story. If that makes sense. So there's a behavioral bias called the curse of knowledge. And what that means is that once you learn something, it's almost impossible to remember what it was like not to know what that thing was. And so I know I definitely suffer from this, right? Like I go into a meeting and I want to launch right into behavioral science and ideas 42 and blah, 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 and right into the details, and having to trying to force yourself to step back and remember, wait, person doesn't know that yet. Let's remember what it was like before I knew what all this meant. And instead try to tell that story that is far more personally compelling and interesting and generates that excitement.
Okay, so I have a random question that I'm thinking about live as we're talking about this, which is, okay, so let's say, I think a lot about the things that you both just shared. I think a lot about what happens when we go into a meeting, really stressed over a target. And if we don't get this yes in this meeting, what's at stake, what that means. Are we going to lose our job? Will we be able to fund this thing? And how that sort of tunnel visions us in that meeting into this more sort of robotic and disconnected state. We're there, but we're not really in connection with the person. Versus when we let go of that and we have the meeting that you described, where you're excited and creative and visioning and riffing and you're there, you're actually co-regulating with the person and you are feeling connected to them and it feels so good. And then of course that raises more money, whether it's in that moment or later or connected to somebody else, because if it feels so good to you, it likely feels very good to the donor, right? And so that is always in my work, sort of what I focus on helping fundraisers be able to do, to show up and with that type of energy to a meeting. And I'm curious, but your point around sort of those mid goals that achieve the big goal and the way we break those down in fundraising and the impact they have, could we then have those mid goals? What would happen if we had those mid goals not connected to money? What if the mid goal was about connection or about a net score rating that we gave about how we felt after that meeting? And the mid goals were all about those experiences as opposed to the money. Would that work?
Oh, I love that idea. I'd not thought of that one, of even recording it. Did that meeting feel good? I think that's such a great one. Ones that I will set are more, I want to have X number of meetings, or I want to meet this person, or I want to meet X new people. And so it's more about that and not a dollar figure. So I'm less focused on the outcome of the meeting, but I love that different outcome of the meeting, which is how did it feel? What was the quality of the conversation?
Yeah, I love that. I used to have the opposite of that, where I was I need to feel deeply uncomfortable twice a week. I need to have a meeting I dread twice a week. so bad.
Well, But maybe that's back to the like expectation side of things of like normalizing discomfort. So then when you do have discomfort, you're like, well, cool, that helps me achieve my goal of like being uncomfortable twice a day. So woohoo for me, here I am. So I feel like I have both, right? Like I do have some goals around being uncomfortable because I'm like, okay, then I'm pushing my boundary. That's a good sign, right? We don't always want things to feel quote unquote good because sometimes discomfort is a good sign. And sometimes what feels good is us actually avoiding something that is aligned with the higher intention that we want, but sort of it feels good to avoid it because we're very anxious about it, right? So I don't mean for anyone listening to this to sort of oversimplify good feelings and bad feelings, but with a donor meeting in particular, saying like, how connected you feel, how like energized did you feel related to the meeting? Like, okay, I'm going to start to use that now in terms of how I talk to folks about it.
Yeah, and as you raise it, I wonder what the equivalent is for emails. Right? So much of our interaction asks are now happening over email, whether that's asking for that meeting in the first place and or even sending a pitch. Some of the just writings for advice from psychology on how to write for busy people and so on, it says, like, make it easy for the other person to respond, especially if it's a no. Because saying no is psychologically really, really painful for anyone. We just don't like it. You feel guilty, especially if you like the other person. You want to do something for them. If saying no feels really bad. So can you make it easier for them to say no by including a possible reason in the email or asking in a way that they're not saying no to you personally. They're not saying no to the ask. Maybe they're just saying, hey, this is not a good time.
Yeah, I usually in my fundraising emails actually give those options at the end. Like I'll say something like, I know that there's a lot going on right now. I want to make sure there is no pressure around this. Feel free to respond with like, bad timing, reach out in 6 months, or I'm focused on other things right now. And just know that like, I'm so grateful for all of the work that we've done together. And because to your point earlier, the ghosting is the worst, right? The worst. You just don't, and then you waste so much time wondering, should I still be pursuing this connection? Like to me, no's are wonderful. They are clear. I want them way more than I want silence, right? And so like, yes, I love that. Make it easy for people to take action, make it easy for people to say no. But I'm curious, like, okay, to your point before around how do we integrate that into emails? It made me think about how do we integrate the fundraiser side of it too? Like, what would happen if like after we clicked send on our email, those like, I think it's just in Europe, maybe not, where they have the buttons you push in the airport, like you go through security and there's like 5 colored buttons, like how was your experience, right? And you like hit one. But I'm like, what if like after you sent an email, there was like a tiny little pop-up that was like, how did it feel to send that email? And you could like click a button and sort of track like how you were feeling in your own communication. But how would that impact resistance to sending it?
It would if you also then got feedback or got a chance to reflect on why you felt bad or particularly good. What was it? So if there was little AI chatbot there that then said, oh, you made really extreme rating, either on the positive or negative side, tell me more. It asks you a couple of questions. And then it later tells me, like, the last 100 emails you sent, the ones you really liked sending, these were common themes. And the ones you really hated, these were common themes. So that would be super helpful.
Okay, Sarah, what's coming up?
Yeah, a little more nitty gritty, I guess, but or tactical. For me, I hate email. I mean, everyone does. I don't like, it's funny, it goes back to this like procrastination and uncertainty. There are certain things that I know will just send me into like if I have to look up something, like I have to look up an old email and then, this is funny because this happened recently. Piyush, we can talk about it later. No, there was someone that I had to follow up with. It took me like 2 weeks to send this person an email. And you know why? Because I knew that I had to look back at my email. And I knew that when I found my last email with them, I was going to feel bad because I knew there was probably, I probably should have followed up sooner. And so it was bringing up these like painful moments, right? So that I have less of a solution for that. Sometimes calling it out actually like right now helps a little bit. Now I feel better about it. The other thing, though, that will trip me up is if I have to, look up a resource or something. And so I've A couple things I have for that. So one, I have a folder on my desktop that's just called commonly emailed things, commonly emailed. If it's like a concept note that I send over and over again or something, I get that link right there. So that removes that barrier. And then the other one, and Mallory, I have to tell you this, and you'll appreciate this a lot, because when Piyush was like, hey, we're going to do this podcast, man, her name sounds so familiar, and I'm not quite sure why. And I went back into my email, and I found several years ago, I read something or I watched something that you put together, and I have a draft email script from something that you shared that was this. It was like overcoming, it was like the cold email, which was something, again, I would always put off. Like, how do you make that transition that's like, I'm cool, I'm not like transactional, but I have this thing I really want to talk to you about. And so that's been really helpful. So having those little scripts, I think, can be really helpful.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Oh my gosh, that makes me so happy.
I can read it to you right now. Ready?
Yeah. You're having impact, Valerie. You're having impact.
Oh my gosh, that makes me so happy. What a
I just
story.
saw this thing you did about blank. I'm so inspired by the way you're investing in blank. Over here at Ideas 42, we're actually working on the same problem. Anyway, it's been super helpful. So I used to do a lot of fundraising around climate, and that was a new area for us. So we often had no connection, or we didn't have anything to build on. So that was really helpful.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I love that story. But the first part that you said is also super interesting, because when you were saying the thing, like, what are the threads that are similar between different fundraisers' experience? That is a very common thing related to whatever it is. It's that, like, if I'm exposed to that stimuli, or if I'm exposed to that thing, I'm going to feel bad about myself. If I go into the meeting with the donor, I'm going to be reminded that we aren't as close to our fundraising goal as we should be, and I'm going to feel bad. Right. And so there's so much resistance because of really how we're going to talk to ourselves when we get to the next stage of the process. And I don't know if this plays into your work at all, but in case it does, I wanted to bring it up, which is what's the role that sort of self-compassion plays or self-talk plays in designing our behaviors?
Yeah, it's not an area of expertise for me. My therapist is very good at this, solving this sort of stuff. Having teammates, having colleagues I can vent, I can just share those down moments with, that really helps in those cases. It's encouraging. It's also encouraging when my teammates are less demotivated than I have made myself in that moment, right? They'll pull me up. So that could be helpful. There was a different thought on this, so you said, one of the negative things that people might remember is, oh, shoot, I'm behind on my goal, or I don't have enough funding. That is really important. There's all this research that our co-founding academics did on scarcity and the cost of scarcity, whether it be scarcity of money, scarcity of time. They mostly study people experiencing poverty where, because you're having to make so many trade-off decisions constantly, oh, can I afford this or buy this thing or that thing because I can't buy both? Those sorts of decisions are so taxing on our minds that it's like living with having lost a whole night's of sleep at all times. You're just that cognitively tired. And then what that causes is you tend to tunnel on immediate needs and you don't plan for the future as much, right? So the same goes with fundraising. If I'm fundraising in a time of scarcity, all of those stressors are amplified. I'm probably just so focused on that fundraising goal. I'm not connecting with the person. I'm not really listening to them. If there's a long-term opportunity there that could be 10x of the thing I'm asking for now, I'm just not even, not going to see that thing. So we really try to not stop fundraising. It's so easy to stop in the high points. Like, oh, wait, we have to execute on all this work. We don't have staff. We don't have time. Like, let's just stop. Let's just focus on the work. It's great. We're done. It's really tempting to take that moment and enjoy it and enjoy the work and not keep doing the fundraising. But that's the easiest time to do the fundraising.
Okay. that's a whole other podcast episode that I really want to have around sort of scarcity, material scarcity and scarcity mindset and the impact that has on things, right? Which are two different things, but not unrelated in a lot of contexts. But scarcity mindset certainly runs a lot of things in this nonprofit sector, even when we aren't experiencing material scarcity, or because on February 15th, you do not have all of your fundraising done for the year, but scarcity mindset makes you feel a level of material scarcity then because you have so much uncertainty around it. So I think that's like a whole other conversation that I would love to have. I want to make sure before we completely run out of time, at the very beginning, you said something around regret, or you were talking about the emotions related to things. And so maybe this is also, you're like, Mallory, this is also a separate podcast, but I'm curious about the role avoidance of negative emotions. And if you use those like consciously or intentionally to help drive behavior. I got into a really interesting conversation with somebody recently about shame. And like my orientation is like, I don't want anybody to feel shame, like that's like my heart like speak. But he was arguing with me that like, but what if avoidance of feeling shame drove them to take these actions that you want them to take? And so I'm just curious, we don't have to talk about shame specifically, but I'm curious about the avoidance of negative emotions and the way that that can play into behavior design.
And Sarah, you were thinking about regret, so do you want to start?
No, let me think. Well, okay, here's something, this is a bit, now taking it back sort of philosophical, but something that, so we've been doing this work on giving for a while, and one of the reasons we got brought into it to begin with, right, is household giving in the US has been trending downward for many years. And there's been a lot of conversation and discussion about like, why is that? A lot of theories out there. But I think one interesting, maybe uncomfortable truth might be that, and I like to use this example of the combined federal campaign, which is a fundraising campaign, right, run through the federal government. And the way it would work is, in the old days, is like, your coworker Bob would like come over with a clipboard and be like, Mallory, it's fundraising week. Like, how much can I sign up for you? And you'd give him a number, and then it would come out of your paycheck automatically. And then it had been trending down for a while. But then now I'm not going to get the year right, but 10 years ago or so, they put it entirely online. And that year they saw the steepest drop yet. And I think, so this is the uncomfortable piece, is like, what does it mean? What does that mean? Like, so a big part of it likely is because Bob wasn't standing there with a clipboard anymore. And so you didn't feel that social pressure, but that social pressure, that's like shame. That's what you're talking about, right? It's like if I say no to Bob, like that that hurts, right? That feels very painful. And I don't know, this is something like I think I'm still grappling with. It's like, what does it mean if the answer is like to increase giving or to increase someone's performance or whatever it is to actually introduce that negative emotion again and to use it for the greater good. But yeah, no, what does that mean if we're going to go that direction?
I was thinking of a different aspect of regret. I was trying to recall some of the research on it. And it's very tied to anticipation. So why am I avoiding that negative emotion? Well, the only way I can avoid it is if I anticipate it somehow. And what is causing me to anticipate that negative emotion in the first place? So in the regret aversion literature, often the experiments are, you're going to choose investment A versus investment B. And then you're going to measure, whether you regret your choice. Now, if you tell people in advance that we're going to tell you which investment did better, then the regret aversion is much higher because they know they're going to see the result of the thing they didn't choose. But if they're not going to see the result of the thing they didn't choose, they don't worry about regret as much. Now, in this case, in the fundraising case, it becomes more personal and about how much we anticipate that negative emotion. If I really, really just focus on all my failures all the time and not my successes, I'm going to anticipate negative emotion every time I go into a meeting, every time I send an email. But instead, if I'm one of those, amazing salespeople who just only thinks about their wins and is unflappable, then I don't do that. So I don't know how to solve this exactly, but I think where I would go with it is asking, where is that anticipation coming from of the negative emotion? Or can I do something about those drivers?
Okay, I love that. And maybe there's a way to to link the avoidance of something with the positive goal of something. Like maybe instead of the clipboard, you being ashamed to say no, if it gave people a sense of belonging, that people like them invest in things like this and it was a good experience. And so how do you sort of like think about the flip? So I really appreciate that. I am so grateful. We used every second we had. I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you both so much for joining me. Where can folks go to learn more about your work, to donate to your nonprofit? Tell everybody.
Sarah, go ahead. You might remember our URL for our charitable giving page.
She has
but Ideas 42 is just
ideas42.org. Certainly is our organization. And then, do we have a separate giving page? We do have a separate giving page.
We can drop the link. We can drop the link in the show notes as well.
Yeah. It's just ideas42.org/giving.
Amazing. Thank you both so much.
No, thank you for the conversation. This was your instruction of not having any goal or prep made this one of those fun conversations that we were talking about.
Yeah. Great. That is always my goal, that we feel energized and connected and curious and all of those things. So I try hard to practice what I preach. So thank you.
Thank you.